cause of our better cooperation is because we have a shared ground of interest.
金砖合作的一条重要经验
A key experience is we searching a larger common ground than differences, and we do more
在有分歧的地
to
方
multiply
多做减法。
our consensus and convergent our interest.
五国领导人
For our
应该发挥
cooperation
战略
in the
引领
second
作用
golden era,
放眼
we
长远
bear the bigger
把
picture
握
in
好金砖
mind,
合作正确
sees
的方向，
the trend of cooperation
推动金砖
among
合作
BRICS
继续
countries
行稳致
and
远。
push forward our cooperation go
我
far
们要在联合国、20国集团、世界贸易组织等多边技术
with the
框架内
multilateral mechanisms
加
such
强
as the
政策协调。
G20. We
内部
should
交流
do
时
more in
畅
the
所
policy coordination
对外
and be
则发出
open to each
一致
other,
声音
and we also send the
展
one
现
signal
金砖
to
团
the
结
outside.
的力量。
This also showcased the solidarity
金砖加
of
合作
BRICS countries.
是
The
金砖战略
cooperation
伙伴关
of
系
BRICS
重要的
Plus
组成部分和
is
自
one
然
of
的
the
延伸。
important force
我们要以不
and
同
a
方式
natural
推
expansion
进
of
金
our
砖加合作
cooperation. Therefore, we should redouble our efforts in this regard, working with developing countries, emerging economies to search and seek
推动完善
greater
全球治理
benefit. Second, we
当
should
前多
improve
边
the
主义
global
在全
governance.
球治理体系受到严重
Unilateralism
冲击
bring a big impact to international order. This concerned all parties.
金砖国家要坚定支持
BRICS countries firmly support
维护以国际法为基础
multilateralism
的国际秩序，
and the international
以联
orders
合国为核心的国际体系，
with
倡
UN
导共
centered.
商共建共享
And we should follow the principle of consultation coordination for shared
和长期
benefit.
管辖，
And we firmly reject the practice of
世
long-arm
界贸易组织
jurisdiction
改革问题关乎
and
新兴市场
unilateralism.
国家和发展中国家重大共
This
同利益
is
金砖国家在
in
这
our
个
core
问题上
concern
有相同
among
或
the
相近
BRICS
看法。
countries. We share the same or similar opinion in this regard.
捍卫世贸组
We
织
should
核心价值和基本原则
Safeguard
包括
the
发
core
展中国家
interests
理应享有的特殊与差别待
of
遇，
WTO and multilateral trading system, and we should resolve the issues
还要积极推动国际社会落
in
实
terms of the
联合
elections.
国2030年
And
可
we
持续
should
发展
also
议程
to implement the 2030 agenda of sustainable development, a Paris Agreement.
第三，
Third,
深化各领域务实合作。
we should strengthen our cooperation
在我们共同努力
in
下
various fields. With our
金
concerted
砖经
effort,
济、政治安全、
economies,
人文交
political
流、
safety,
三
people
轮
to
驱
people
动合作
exchange
取得
are
丰
the
硕
three key drivers.
我们要再接再厉，平衡推
Let's
动
work
三大
together
合作
in along this
夯
path.
实金砖合作基础。
We've further strengthened
中方
our
高度赞赏
cooperation
八方
foundation.
将科技创新作为今年合作的重点。
And this year, we also bring the technology innovation cooperation as our key focus for this year. I believe this will further unlock our potential in this regard and produce
要加快建
outcomes.
设金砖
We
新
should
工业革
step
命
up
伙伴关系，
A new industrial relationship among the BRICS countries and also build up our network in this regard.
提升金砖国家竞争力。
And we also should strengthen our competitive advantages in this regard. And we also search the new way of cooperation for win-win cooperation, not for self-claimed supremacy. And we should be open and also create an enabling environment with non-discrimination.
各个国家
So we should embrace all countries and companies from each countries to join our cooperation
各位同事，
and stand ready to share the
让我们
benefits.
继续
Dear colleagues,
相互支持、相互
let's
帮助，
continue to give
一
each
起为
other
我国人
support
民的美好生活
and work to work
构建
together
人类命运
to
共同体
deliver benefits for our
做出
people and
实现。
build a community for shared future for mankind. Thank you.
That was President Xi Jinping speaking at the G20 summit. Now let's discuss this a bit more with Jiang Shixue, a professor at Shanghai University. Welcome to our show, Professor Jiang. Now, President Xi there was talking about the BRICS countries. Can you explain to us how the BRICS countries and this mechanism fits into the G20, the parallels and the similarities?
Well, this kind of organization was established more than 10 years ago. And they are the 5 most important emerging economies in the world today. And no matter you are talking about global economic governance or anti-terrorism, cybersecurity, the so-called global climate change, well, you need to seek the assistance or help from these 5 most important emerging economies. And without the help, without their participation, you cannot deal with all the kinds of global issues. So I think it is very important for the 5 leaders to meet in Osaka to think about the future, near-term, long-term measures, how to fight against the so-called unilateralism, trade protectionism. So I think it's very important for them to meet. Well, the more you meet, the more consensus you will have.
Now, President Xi talked about global governance as well as a key issue here. What issues do you think he means when he talks about tackling this?
Well, when we talk about global governance, it means the methodology or the ways of dealing global issues. Well, if you ask me what are the global issues, well, it's countless. Well, the so-called trade governance, financial governance, anti-terrorism, climate change, poverty, all kinds of things. Even the so-called cyber insecurity. Lots of global issues. Okay, so these 5 important emerging economies should join hands, along with the U.S. and other developed countries, to deal with so many global issues. And so Xi Jinping says that we should strengthen our efforts to fight against these kind of global issues. And now, don't forget, 2 months ago, President Xi Jinping mentioned that we are suffering from a deficit of governance. That means we need to make more. So we need to do more to deal with these kind of global issues. Otherwise, the world will suffer from these kind of global issues.
But what is it that BRICS countries can do then within the G20 to address global governance and balance this?
Yes, I would say this kind of BRICS organization can do many things. Nowadays, as you know, the U.S. is fighting against many countries of its trade partners in terms of the so-called tax raise. And I think I think these 5 most important emerging economies should join hands to send a clear signal to the U.S. that trade protectionism is a two-edged knife. It hurts the BRICS. It also hurts the U.S. economy. And also we need to strengthen financial regulation in terms of global financial, the so-called global financial governance. And also we need to join hands with many countries to fight against terrorism. Okay, and also cybersecurity, many issues. So the key question is how BRICS should do.
Right.
Okay.
Do you expect the trade issue, well, US President Donald Trump's trade war against his partners, to feature greatly in this G20 summit this year?
And well, regarding this area, I think there will be more opportunities for these 5 big emerging economies to trade more. Now, these 4 emerging economies so far are among the major trade partners for China. I would say in the face of the U.S. trade protectionism, I think China should seek this kind of golden opportunity to trade more with them.
All right, well, Professor, we'll speak to you again later in the show. Let's look a bit more at this next story, which is in the port city of Kobe in Japan. And over there, a Chinese school is celebrating its 120th anniversary. Now, throughout the years, the school has educated numerous students and served as a bridge between China and Japan. CGTN's Zheng Yibing finds out more.
The campus is based in the bright sunshine of western Japan's city of Kobe. It looks like other schools perhaps, but this one is unique.
On this beautiful campus, we found many Chinese elements which aim to pass such traditions and culture on to students.
Various courses are taught in Chinese. It's a challenge for students who are born in Japan. They are trying hard to learn.
I began learning Chinese folk music when I was in 4th grade, and I've been practicing on local art for 6 years.
I painted that peony when I was a student in the 3rd grade. I am so proud.
The school was founded 120 years ago when the Chinese intellectual Liang Qichao visited Kobe and inspired the Chinese there to set up the school for children.
Children of overseas Chinese living in Kobe back then began to have a place to learn Chinese history and geography. This is what we call the passing on of the cultural heritage.
After graduation, these students will take the entrance examination to get into senior high school and college, and then go to different corners of the Japanese society.
Our graduates include Ms. Lin Liyun, who served as the translator for Chinese leaders back in 1972 when China and Japan normalized their ties.
Throughout years, the school has experienced twists and turns and never ceased to pass on Chinese values of solidarity, friendship, and mutual love, and it hopes to continue to do so. Yibing, CGTN, in Kobe, Japan.
You've traveled to places where others couldn't be, seen things others couldn't imagine, and heard stories you can't be sure whether to believe. They say that you're privileged, that people look up to you. But only you know how much effort you've made. You're on the ultimate journey to discover a country with 5,000 years of history and nearly 1.5 billion people. Is it a green countryside or a vast sea of neon lights and skyscrapers? Is it a dangerous land choked with smog or the blue sky of a summer's day? What is this China for you? And what is this China for the rest of the world? CGTN. See the difference.
At least one person has died following 2 terrorist attacks in downtown Tunis, with many more injured. Hundreds of policemen, National Guard and anti-terror units were deployed after Thursday's attacks. The Islamic State extremist group has claimed responsibility. CGTN's Adnan Shawushi reports from Tunisia's capital.
A municipal police officer wounded in a suicide attack perpetrated at the Avenue de France, downtown Tunis, has died. 2 police officers and 3 civilians were injured during this attack. The terrorist blew himself up in front of a police patrol. Eyewitnesses say the blast was strong.
The scene was horrible. The attack is symbolic because it took place at a strategic location where thousands of Tunisians meet in the morning. It is a shopping avenue where several important buildings are located.
A second terrorist attempted to enter the anti-terrorism unit's building. He blew himself up at the parking of the high-security facility. Analysts assert that terror cells aim to destabilize Tunisia economically and politically, a few months before the holding of the legislative and presidential elections.
The successive bombings mean that terrorists do not want Tunisians to live in peace. The whole political transition is the target. The attack hit the capital, but will impact the economy, because downtown Tunis is a tourist destination.
Many Tunisians have gathered near the bombing site. They denounced the suicide attacks and expressed solidarity with the victims and the security forces.
We send condolences to the family of the victim and all Tunisians. He's a martyr who died for the country. The security forces and the national army are the guardians of the state. We support them in their fight against terrorists who can't defeat Tunisians.
Tunisian President Beji Qaid Essebsi, who is severely ill, was rushed to the military hospital in Tunis. 3 weeks ago, Qaid Essebsi had declared a state of emergency nationwide to face a growing terror threat.
According to the Interior Minister, the anti-terrorism units have foiled dozens of terror plots in many regions. Over 30 suspects were arrested in recent months. However, the vigilance of the state did not prevent the bombing in Habib Bourguiba Avenue. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
Iran says it could soon exceed the 300-kilogram limit on its enriched uranium stockpile set by a 2015 nuclear deal with world powers. That's unless Britain, France and Germany take timely steps to preserve the agreement. The AFP cites a diplomatic source in Vienna saying Iran is not expected to exceed the limit this weekend, possibly for political reasons. But Iran says it can no longer continue to be the only country complying with the deal. It's demanding that Europe take action to protect companies that trade with Iran from being punished by the United States. A record-breaking heat wave is set to bring temperatures beyond 40 degrees Celsius in some regions in Europe. In France, there has been an increase in medical emergency calls due to the extreme heat. Some schools are expected to close, while traffic will be restricted to limit air pollution. In Spain, hundreds of firefighters and soldiers are battling a forest fire in the country's eastern region. Meanwhile, Greece is on red alert with 45 degrees temperatures reported nationwide. Weather institutes in Poland and the Czech Republic have also recorded their highest ever June temperatures in history. And that's all for now on The World Today. I'm Jiao Yang in Beijing. Thanks for watching.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
As the G20 summit gets underway in Japan on Friday, all eyes will be on the bilateral meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump. And while some predict a truce to the ongoing trade war, mixed signals from the U.S. mean nobody can be sure. In an interview on Wednesday, President Donald Trump said he's planning to impose additional tariffs on Chinese exports if talks fail to yield a constructive outcome. And these remarks followed the latest move by the U.S. to blacklist 5 Chinese supercomputer organizations, once again citing, quote, national security. Considering this, should we really expect the talks to resolve the current deadlock? And how will Japan, as the host, mediate between China and the U.S.? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Qiuyuan, sitting in for Liu Xin. Joining me from Boston is Dr. Jim Walsh, a senior research associate at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Security Studies program. And here in the studio in Beijing with me is Professor Liu Baocheng at the University of International Business and Economics. Great to see you both. Welcome. Let me start with Dr. Walsh. Now, we've been seeing mixed signals coming from Washington in the lead up to this high-stake meeting. In his interview with Fox Business Network on Wednesday, Trump said substantial additional U.S. tariffs would be placed on goods from China if no progress on a trade deal is made with President Xi Jinping. And he said, quote, I'm quoting his words, "My plan B with China is to take in billions and billions of dollars a month, and we will do less and less business with them." Well, how seriously should we take these comments by President Donald Trump?
Well, after more than 2 years now, I think there's a pretty strong track record that the president often has very strong rhetoric and says strong things, and sometimes those actions follow, and sometimes they don't. So I wouldn't put too much stock in any one particular statement. I mean, in Iran this week, the president, said all sorts of things in all sorts of different directions. He said he was going to obliterate Iran, and he talked about, no, he only wanted to act proportionally. So I don't know that the statements are as indicative as the behavior. But I would guess, based, as you have suggested, there's some early media reporting that hints at a fact that there might be a truce, a pause in the ever growing number of tariffs that are being imposed on all the parties. I think that's the best possible outcome. I think that would be a good outcome, but I would hold my breath because I don't think anything is set in stone yet.
So a temporary truce might be a good outcome, but President Trump has also commented saying that my plan B is maybe my plan A, saying that my plan B is that if we don't make a deal, I will tariff, and maybe not at 25%, but maybe at 10%. That's his words. I don't think that's a plan B. That's just what comes after talks break down. But Professor Liu, what are we supposed to read from these conflicting statements?
Well, that's his style of negotiation, to come to negotiate with tease and with threat so that the other would really feel jitter. And when the other is really being confused, and they may decide to backtrack on the bottom line they set. But this is not really the way to deal with China because one is that Chinese leaders, they are pretty much unified and they have very clearly defined principles as how negotiation can proceed, and they have a clear understanding what are those causes behind it which China doesn't really unilaterally bear the blame. So without the right type of respect, without the type of reciprocity, in negotiation, simply by browbeating, bullying the other to capitulate, and I think he is really underestimated the firmness of the Chinese negotiator and Chinese leader, but in the meantime, he also underestimated the resilience the Chinese economy can play, even the China and the U.S. trade is being diminished.
And how much of this posturing, being tough on China, is Trump playing to his base ahead of next year's election, Dr. Walsh?
Well, of course, it's hard to know his intentions, but that would be consistent with his behavior in other areas. He's all about pleasing the base. The trade war with China and immigration, I think, are two of his most important issues to that base that has been successful for him. And so certainly, if not driven by domestic politics, it's certainly a big factor. And as you know, the president recently kicked off his re-election campaign, and we had presidential debates last night. And so I think that sort of thing will grow more intense over time as the election calendar continues. But, I think the core issue here, you can ask yourself, well, how much of this is tactics and strategy on Trump's part? I personally think it's just personality and psychology, not policy. I think this is just the way he is. This is the way he operates. He operates this way on every issue, whether it's China or something else entirely. So it's really more of a style of personality and a mindset rather than some sort of devious set of negotiating tactics.
But Professor Liu, isn't that true that is ultimately going to be his voters who are going to be hurt by this? I mean, business sales are going to take a hit. Their jobs might possibly on the line. Their living costs might go up if the tariffs takes place. Isn't that true that they're going to ultimately pay the price?
Well, the reason that his constituency supported him because they do feel the problem, the loss of job, the loss of decent job, and the shanty houses that needs to repair the roof, etc. But do they really place the right bet on the right move? So that's another big question. So he made beautiful promises to those people. I'm going to bring jobs back. I'm going to reindustrialize the nation so that everyone can be happy. But now, after almost 2 years, what has been delivered? And the Holland Tunnel is still under repaired, and all the infrastructures have not really been taking place, although with all the promises, and also all those farmers. So right now he's really paying a compensation to subsidize those farmers due to the result of the trade war, but that doesn't give people hope. That doesn't give people a basic calculation of what they can do next year whatsoever. So now people do feel the pain because consumers are paying higher prices and farmers have difficulty to export their stuff, and even multinational companies that are situated in America, they are blocked doing business with their regular partner like Huawei, etc. So, fantasy is now being displaced by reality. So I think this trend is going to develop further.
Now, U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin remarked on Wednesday in an interview with CNBC saying that the U.S. and China were close to a trade deal. He said, quote, "We were about 90% of the way there," and he thinks there's a path to complete this. Dr. Walsh, do you share his view that a deal is within reach, and what is this final 10% that needs to be negotiated?
Well, I assume in principle a deal should be possible. There's an old saying in diplomacy, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And if you're 90% the way there, odds are that last 10% is the toughest part of the 100%, right? That's why it gets left to the end, because it's hard. So I would not take that as strongly indicating that something will happen. It's sort of par for the course. And I'd like to respectfully disagree a little bit with my colleague back in Beijing. I mean, he's right to point to the fact that the trade war has had an economic impact on the U.S. economy, and the Federal Trade Reserve, at the aggregate level, the federal chairman of the Federal Reserve is talking about cutting interest rates, switching positions, in part because of fears for the U.S. economy. But right now, and for the last 2 years, the economy has been going gangbusters. It has, unemployment's low, et cetera, et cetera. And so some people may not be doing well, farmers. Other people are probably doing quite well. And so that gives the president some leeway. It gives him some leverage. And so on the one hand, he has political challenges, but I think the U.S. economy is probably stronger than China's economy today. And then it's a question of, who can take the punches? Will a softening global economy because of this trade war hurt China sufficiently that it is more motivated to get something done? Or will the president be more motivated to get something done? But it's not entirely clear who is suffering more. I think all the parties are suffering. The suffering will increase rather than decrease. But the U.S. economy right now is sort of bailing the president out because, the stock market keeps rising, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a bit of an advantage for him in these negotiations.
Professor Liu, I want to respond to that?
Yes. I believe that the U.S. economy is temporarily doing good in terms of the three prime indicators: employment, inflation, and the GDP growth. But the first question is that can the existing cabinet led by Donald Trump take the full credit? Is it something that is really developed in the growth cycle? That's one question. The other is that as the two biggest economies, United States and China, what type of a responsible example they are going to place, when they really adopt a zero-sum type of game, punching the other and see who is going to first fall. So right now at the G20, when the world finally managed to a basic recovery, and when two elephants are fighting in the zoo, so how would other monkeys and other animals would really look at this drama, and then can that also further push the other members to get more united in terms of more a tightened trade agreement that can shun the United States. So is the current existing appearance of prosperity doesn't really give him the right type of credit in actuality through basic economic analysis, and also the prospect may not really warrant a sustainable prosperity.
It sounds like we're going to see something very interesting at the G20 summit. But meantime, the U.S. Commerce Department last week blacklisted 5 Chinese supercomputing organizations, as we mentioned earlier, saying they pose a threat to national security, cutting them off from crucial American technology. Dr. Walsh, I want to get your take on this. Why is the U.S. targeting China's supercomputing organizations after banning Huawei?
Well, I think this is sort of a longer story than the trade story. And it's, obviously economics gets mixed in, but it's closer to being a national security issue than it is a pure trade and economic issue. So there's concern in the U.S. That state-supported businesses in China, particularly in high technology, which has applications to national defense, or that may in the future, in a 5G world, could shape access to information, that those are national security issues. And people are worried in the U.S. about the close ties between, China is a communist state, right? So people are worried about the ties between the government and particular corporations who have subsidized those, who have been subsidized by the government, and who people fear might be involved with those corporations. So it is a more complex, believe it or not, it's even more complex than trade.
And just how should we look at this coming just days before Xi and Trump's meeting? Dr. Walsh.
Yeah, again, I would not look for some master threat.
Live to Osaka, where Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is welcoming leaders from G20 member states and other international organizations for this 2-day G20 summit. This is the 14th G20 summit. President Xi Jinping from China right now, shaking hands with Shinzo Abe. And we are going to discuss this further with our studio guest, Professor Jiang Shixue from Shanghai University. Professor, coming back to you. Now, President Xi Jinping and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, they met just ahead of this G20 summit, and they agreed on lots of consensus items, and they said that the countries should champion free trade. What's your view on China-Japan relations? They've been through a lot of ups and downs.
As you know, China and Japan shares the same merits and the same tradition of the so-called Asian civilization.
Mm-hmm.
And in this kind of civilization, people have this kind of belief that a close neighbor is more helpful than a kind of distant friend or relative. So China and Japan have 1,000 reasons to improve their relations. Okay, they are very important economies. They should play a very important role in pushing forward global governance. And sadly, over the past several years, these two nations had some kind of problems. Now we are happy to see that the page is over. So according to the 10 consensus between the two important leaders, China and Japan will seek help in all kinds of areas. And President Xi Jinping is invited by Mr. Abe to visit Japan so next spring. And there will be a high-level dialogue mechanism for people-to-people exchanges. And just remember, the two leaders agree to pay more attention to manage these kind of sensitive issues. Okay, so what are the sensitive issues? My understanding will be territorial dispute, the Diaoyu Island, and then the historical issue, because Japan has never recognized its war crimes against China. So hopefully that now we are going to see a new page. So this kind of improved relationship is good for China, for Japan, and for maintaining world peace and development.
So in this new page, so to speak, what would you say are some of the most important areas that we might see China and Japan working on?
Well, there are two dimensions. One is the bilateral, the other is so-called multilateral. So for the bilateral, as you know, that they are going to deal with sensitive issues. If we can ask Japan to stick to the basic principle of the 4 documents between the two sides, I think we can hopefully that we can see a better future for the bilateral relations. So this is on the bilateral dimension. Now, on the so-called multilateral stage, well, they are so important, Japan and China. They can cooperate in pushing forward the so-called free trade among Asia and the Pacific, and also global economic governance. And so we are going to see the summit is going to discuss many important issues: innovation, cybersecurity, or the so-called green economy, sustainable development, and even global imbalance. They are very important issues for China, for Japan, and for the world economy.
So of these issues, what kind of agreements do you expect might come out of this summit then?
The 10 consensus, I think, are very important.
So of the G20 summit, I mean.
Okay.
The
For the G20 summit, well, as you know that China and many other important trade partners of the U.S. are suffering from the so-called trade war. So I'm not sure whether this time the summit will do something to stop the U.S. from doing more trade wars against its trade partners. I think the summit should send a very clear signal to the U.S. This kind of trade war is not good either for the U.S. economy. Well, many commentators that said that this kind of trade war will cost 1 percentage point less for world economic growth for 2019. So you can see that the so-called G20 should not be a kind of monkey watching the tigers fighting in the mountain, okay? So we need to do something. Now, the problem is whether or not the G20 can stop the U.S. from waging this kind of trade war.
Well, exactly. So that's what I want to ask.
Are they going to be effective? Well, the possibility is quite slim according to some international commentators. But we cannot count on one summit to deal with every aspect of this kind of unilateralism and trade, and also trade protectionism. But I think this time the G20 summit should send a very clear signal to the U.S. In this regard, this G summit is very important and very positive.
Well, I mean, that's one of the goals of the G20 summit that Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had set out earlier in his sort of preview of the summit. You know, he said free trade. We need to champion free trade. But here's what's awkward for Abe. I mean, the US is a very key ally of Japan. So how will he balance this then?
Yes, Japan needs to be a friend for everybody. But regarding the bilateral relationship between Japan and the U.S., I think their focus is on the so-called security issue.
Right.
But in terms of trade, I think Japan, I believe that Japan also suffers from the trade war waged by the U.S. Hopefully that Japan will realize that it should do something. It should join hands with China, the EU, and many other partners to fight against this kind of unilateralism and trade, and also trade protectionism, starting from by the U.S. Hopefully that after this summit, we are going to see one more new page for the world economy. So hopefully, who knows? Because some international commentators said that we're going to see the old wine in the old bottle. But some others say, well, not necessarily. Maybe probably there will be some kind of new wine in the new bottle. So who knows? Let's wait and see.
Well, how influential would you say the G20 is on the global stage? I mean, it is at the end of the day 19 countries and some international organizations. I mean, how powerful are they to affect real changes in the world?
The G20 is powerful. First of all, let me say so. Okay, the G20 was created in more than 10 years ago. At that time, there was a so-called international financial tsunami. So everybody in the world suffered a lot. So the G20 joined hands, the developed and the emerging economies. They did a good job by pushing the world economy out of the woods. But now the world economy, well, is still sluggish, but it's okay. So we need to push forward economic growth for the world economy. Now the question is, how can we do it? Okay. Now I think, for me, I would suggest that the G20 should change its function. Okay. So 10 years ago, in the face of the so-called international financial tsunami, the G20 was acting like a life-saving boat, a firefighter to deal with the world economic crisis. And now I think it should pay more attention to global economic governance. This is the most important issue the G20 should do. Otherwise, the G20 will be criticized again as a talk shop. It should be the club of actions, not the talk shop.
Well, Professor, on that note, thank you for your insight, and we want to look a little closer at the functions that the G20 serves then and today. Well, it has come a long way since it was initiated some 20 years ago. And aside from the economy and trade, this mechanism covers an even wider scope nowadays. CGTN's Toby Muse takes a look at the organization's development for us.
The G20 is celebrating, appropriately enough, its 20th anniversary. The organization brings together some of the world's largest economies and the European Union. Born as a result of the Asian financial crisis, since its first meeting in 1999 Berlin, it has sought to encourage financial stability across the globe. Its members account for 90% of the gross world product and 2/3 of the world's population. James P. Moore Jr. has been working on issues of international trade since his time in the government of US President Ronald Reagan in the 1980s.
I think it's achieved its goals in simply bringing people together, and that's important. But I think it's also important to realize that over the past 20 years, we have become more interconnected globally and technologically than ever before.
Working closely, different countries were able to offset some of the deeper dangers of the 2008 financial crisis. Other summits have resolved controversies over currencies and debt in the European Union. The G20 has become a poster child for globalization, a phenomena that led to an explosion of trade across the planet. Yet in many countries, the benefits seem to weigh to the elites, leaving millions behind. That, in turn, has seen a rise in nationalist movements.
Well, I think some of the leaders that have come to the fore in so many countries, whether it's the Americas, Asia, Europe, beyond, have made it clear that they are much more insular looking, that they're very concerned about their own backyard rather than thinking about anybody else's backyard, not fully recognizing perhaps at times that we're all interconnected and that their own fortunes and future really are dependent on what goes on beyond their backyard.
The challenge for the G20 is whether the group can keep a world focused on globalization when its discontents are ever on the rise. Toby Muse, CGTN, Washington.
Iran has said that it could exceed the limit on its enriched uranium stockpile, which was agreed in the 2015 deal with world powers, unless these countries do something to preserve the agreement. Now, this was announced amid already escalating tensions with the United States. Let's take a look at the major flashpoints in these most recent flare-ups.
Whatever they want to do, I'm ready.
It's a standoff the world's paying close attention to. Iran's move to exceed its uranium stockpile limit, set out by the 2015 nuclear deal, that Trump pulled out of in May 2018 is sending a strong signal beyond the White House to Europe. Tehran's decision 10 days ago to do so came between two pivotal moments Washington sees as sharp escalations: Iran's alleged attack on a Japanese oil tanker and a U.S. drone being shot down in Iranian airspace. The downing of the drone led to Trump placing additional sanctions on Iran, targeting the country's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. It was based on Washington's claims the cleric holds assets abroad, used to fund Iran's so-called proxy fighters, and it was a claim Iran's President Hassan Rouhani bluntly rejected.
The White House actions mean it is mentally retarded.
The response set off a fury of tweets from President Trump in response, with him threatening to obliterate Iran. Tehran also has in its sights other signatories of the deal, the European powers. Iran has delivered an ultimatum: a relief to sanctions by July 7th, or else it'll ramp up uranium enrichment in addition to the threatened buildup of stockpiles. But sanctions relief from Europe would be accompanied by threats of U.S. sanctions against their own companies, putting them in just as tight a spot. Timothy Ulrich, CGTN.
The first China-Africa Economic and Trade Expo is underway in the southern Chinese city of Changsha. Now, more than 10,000 Chinese and African officials and business representatives will be on hand over the course of the three-day event. Officials have promised to solidify trade and industrial development. Chinese President Xi Jinping said in a letter that China and Africa need to expand their cooperation, especially in this area of trade. And we'll wrap it up here. I'm Zhao Yang. I'll see you again in a few minutes for The World Today. Stay with us.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello again, I'm Zhao Yang and this is The World Today. We start in Osaka, Japan, where Chinese President Xi Jinping has begun talks with world leaders ahead of the G20 summit, which opens today. Xi and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe met on Thursday and reached 10 important consensus on China-Japan relations.
A highly anticipated encounter on the eve of the G20 summit. Chinese President Xi Jinping had a working dinner with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe Thursday, marking the latest high point in a years-long effort to repair ties between China and Japan. President Xi said that while the world is undergoing profound changes, mutual interests and common concerns between the two countries are increasing day by day. He urged the two sides to make China-Japan relations an important and positive factor for maintaining world peace and promoting common development. On the economic front, the Chinese leader stressed the two countries should create new areas for cooperation and actively lead regional economic integration. He said China welcomes Japan's active participation in the Belt and Road Initiative. Xi hopes China and Japan can enhance cooperation in international and regional affairs to jointly address global challenges and make global governance more just and reasonable. Meanwhile, Abe said he is pleased bilateral relations have returned to the track of normal development. He noted the two countries should maintain close, high-level exchanges and dialogue, and said Japan is willing to provide a fair and open market environment for businesses of both sides. He mentioned Japan is ready to work with China to properly manage disputes and differences. The Japanese leader invited President Xi to pay a state visit to Japan next spring to take bilateral ties to a higher level. The two leaders also exchanged views on the Korean Peninsula situation and other world issues. Timothy Ulrich, CGTN.
Xi and Abe have praised the development of bilateral relations between China and Japan during their meeting. Both agreed that joint efforts are necessary in building ties that fit the needs of modern times. They vow to enhance political mutual trust and properly handle sensitive issues and strengthen communication in security. Xi and Abe said they will expand cooperation in technology and intellectual property rights protection. They also pledged to work together to uphold multilateralism and the free trade system. They agreed that China and Japan should fulfill their responsibilities on global issues like climate change and arms control, and they are also set to strengthen culture and people-to-people exchanges between their countries. Chinese President Xi has attended an informal meeting with BRICS leaders ahead of the G20 summit. While delivering a keynote speech to the group, Xi spoke about the harms of unilateralism and protectionism.
Dear colleagues, the current international situation is in a complex and a severe period. The world economy as a whole has maintained growth, but uncertainty and instability have increased significantly. One of the most prominent risks is that some of the developed countries have frequently taken protectionist and unilateral measures, intentionally provoking trade frictions and technological blockades, undermining the international trade order and the global industrial chain. These moves harm the common interests of all nations. They also cast a shadow on the peaceful and sustainable development of the world.
President Xi says China will continue to support the United Nations in its handling of global affairs. And he said this during a meeting with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres at the G20. Xi specifically mentioned the crisis in the Persian Gulf region, calling for all parties to maintain restraint and open dialogue. China would also like to work with the UN to promote work on the climate. Guterres, speaking on the current tensions over trade, said the UN will continue its work in supporting multilateralism. He also said he appreciates China's work in dealing with the Korean Peninsula as well as sustainable development. The UN Secretary General has delivered a speech also at the summit. Guterres says the world has made progress on some big problems, but it is not happening fast enough, and many uncertainties in the global economy remain.
Uncertainties due to trade conflicts, but also uncertainties related to high levels of debt, to potential instability in financial markets, the risk of a slowdown in global growth. And obviously, in a situation like this, and even if I pay tribute to the very committed engagement of the government of Japan and the Prime Minister of Japan, for meaningful conclusions of the summit, it is clear that it will be very difficult to have a breakthrough in relation to some of the most difficult challenges that the international community is facing.
We're joined in the studio by Jiang Shixue, professor at Shanghai University. Professor, welcome to our show. Now, earlier you were talking to me about how the G20 has evolved. Now, at its inception, it was a forum for economy, stabilizing the world economy. Now, talk to us a bit more about how it's evolved and what its focuses are now.
Well, actually, starting from a few years ago, particularly starting from the Hangzhou summit, that was 2016, China proposed that we need to shift our focus of the G20 cooperation. That means we are going to pay more attention to the long-term issues, innovation, sustainable development, and all kinds of things. Well, I would say in the past several years, the G20 is slowly shifting away from its past practice of the so-called life-saving boat, or something like firefighters, to a role which can push forward the so-called global economic governance. So this is a very, very positive sign. But hopefully, I think, as you know, that these 20 members should have more efforts. I mean, they should join hands. But now we have to remember, we have to point out that some important player within the G20 is fighting against many of its trade partners in terms of high tariffs. So if there is one very important superpower doing something which is negative towards this kind of global governance, how can we achieve our long-term goals? So I think this summit in Japan can play a very positive role to send a clear signal to the U.S. that this kind of unilateralism and the trade protection is also harmful to you. So you need to you need to change your policies.
Well, I mean, we all know who that certain member is. Do you expect to see some kind of official statement, perhaps, from the G20? Sorry, Professor, just to interrupt you guys. We're now looking at signals, live pictures of the family photo that's been taken at the G20. You can see all the heads of state, as well as the international organizations who are members of the summit, members of the group, standing there at the forefront. There's Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. And obviously we can see the host, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe there, Chinese President Xi Jinping, and Narendra Modi, Indian Prime Minister in the background, British Prime Minister Theresa May, Donald Trump, US President, Russian President Vladimir Putin amongst them. Now the G20 summit brings together 19 heads of state, as well as organizations, international organizations, the European Union, including Jean-Claude Juncker, as well as Donald Tusk. And this is the family photo of the G20. They will start their official meetings after this. Professor, coming back to you now, you were saying that how they will possibly address this issue of a certain member of the G20, well, the US, playing against the rules of free trade.
Well, as you know, that many international commentators have said that we should abandon the so-called wrong mentality of like talk shop. We need to take actions. So I would say yes, deeds are more important than words. So the G20 should not be a talk shop. It should be a club of actions, as the Chinese president suggested some years ago. So hopefully that the G20 will realize that this time we need to do more. Because over the past 1 decade or so, I think this year is really in a more serious, critical moment. I think the G20 should think about the future of the world economy. Otherwise, people will lose their confidence in this kind of G20 club.
And when you talk about action, deeds, not just words, what sort of actions could we see from the G20? Are we talking about perhaps more free trade agreements amongst them?
The most important action the G20 should take is to push forward the Doha round. The Doha round is very important, okay? But the Doha round is half dead, half alive. Right. So, okay, so the G20, because they can benefit from the completion of this kind of Doha round. So I think in the near future, the G20 should really take some actions. But again, some important members in the G20 is not interested in this kind of Doha round. So the problem is whether or not the G20 can do something about this kind of Doha round. Well, many other important issues I think the G20 can do.
On some of the other issues, obviously free trade is a big one, but some of the other issues that you expect to come up at the G20 summit, what topics are those?
Well, innovation. Innovation is good for everybody, okay? But now some countries are using its state powers to contain the so-called scientific and technological development of other countries. Okay, the Huawei is a typical example. So I think that the G20 is right to claim that we should promote innovation, but again, deeds are more important than words. But the G20, I would say, they should have a certain kind of framework. Well, it's not the so-called rule binding, but it has its power to set out some kind of framework so that anything which is against innovation should be abandoned. So let's hope that the G20 will be clever enough to figure out some kind of concrete actions.
Right, and earlier you were talking about global governance and how the G20 is shifting towards now. Now, the representation, the member states of the G20, would you say that's a fair representation of perhaps the world and what it can do in this respect of global governance?
Well, many countries have been complaining that the G20 is not legitimate in terms of representations. Well, countries like Poland, Spain, they say we are big enough to be a member of the G20. But some other commentators say no, Europe has too much representation. Okay, the EU, Germany, UK, France, Italy, they are members of the G20. So they say you should not have more representation for Spain, Poland. Some other big countries, okay, particularly in the developing world, they should be partners or they should be members of the G20. So it's a bureaucratic problem which is being discussed by these G20 members over the past several years. But hopefully I can conclude that the importance of the emerging economies in the G20 should be given more importance. I mean, these emerging economies should play a more important role in the G20.
Some of these countries you talked about are actually joining as a G20 plus, right?
Yes, like the BRICS. Now we have seen the so-called BRICS plus. So apart from these 5 members, some other important emerging economies are invited to take part in this kind of dialogue. So the G20 should follow the principle of BRICS plus, so that we can see that in the near future we can see G20 plus.
Right. Well, thank you, Professor. In the port city of Kobe in Japan, a Chinese school is celebrating its 120th anniversary. And throughout the years, the school has educated numerous students and served as a bridge between China and Japan. CGTN's Zheng Yibing has more.
The campus space in the bright sunshine of western Japan's city of Kobe. It looks like other schools perhaps, but this one is unique.
On this beautiful campus, we find many Chinese elements which aim to pass such traditions and culture on to students.
Various courses are taught in Chinese. It's a challenge for students who are born in Japan. They are trying hard to learn.
I began learning Chinese folk music when I was in 4th grade, and I've been practicing on local art for 6 years.
I painted that peony when I was a student in the 3rd grade. I am so proud.
The school was founded 120 years ago when the Chinese intellectual Liang Qichao visited Kobe and inspired the Chinese there to set up the school for children.
Children of overseas Chinese living in Kobe back then began to have a place to learn Chinese history and geography. This is what we call the passing on of the cultural heritage.
After graduation, these students will take the...
All right, we're going live to Osaka now, where Japanese Prime Minister, also host of the G20 summit, Shinzo Abe, is speaking at the digital economy event. Let's listen in.
Of the G20 Osaka summit. Today, digitalization is causing rapid change to all aspects of the economy and the society. I truly hope that this event will elevate the momentum towards international initiative on digital economy. Hereinafter, I will ask President Xi to deliver a few words, followed by President Incre, President Trump, and Director General Azevedo, and at the end, I will deliver concluding remarks. Now, President Xi Jinping, please take the floor.
Prime Minister Abe, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the present digital economy is growing by leaps and bounds and reshaping the economy and society. As for how can we seize the opportunity and tackle challenges, I would like to offer the following suggestions. First, we need to foster a fair, just, and non-discriminatory market environment. We need to promote the movement of technology, people, information, and other factors, uphold the integrity and dynamism of the global industrial chain, build on our comparative strengths to promote win-win cooperation. We cannot develop ourselves behind closed doors, nor shall we cause disruptions to the market. Second, we need to jointly improve the rules governing data. Data to digital economy is just like oil to the industrial economy. An effective data governance should not only facilitate the collection, analysis, application, and flow of data, but also respect the right to self-management of all countries and ensure secure and orderly utilization of data. In the meantime, we need to fully accommodate the actual conditions and difficulties of developing countries to avoid creating new divide. Third, we need to promote integrated development of digital economy and the physical economy, or the real economy. We need to leverage the role of digital economy as a catalyst to drive the integration between the internet, big data, artificial intelligence, and the real economy, cultivate new drivers of growth, and create impetus for quality economic development. We need to enhance digital infrastructure and promote connectivity. Fourth, we need to enhance the inclusiveness of digital economy. We need to follow a people-centered approach, study the impact of the application of new technologies, properly balance the relationship between equity and efficiency, capital and labor, and technology and employment, so as to increase the sense of gains for all countries and all communities and narrow the digital divide. We need to explore the use of e-commerce, digital finance, and other means to resolve the problem of poverty and promote inclusive and sustainable development. Also, at the same time, on the principle of extensive participation, consensus building, and the balance of interests of developed and developing countries, we need to work for progress in WTO negotiations on e-commerce. As a major country of digital economy, China is willing to actively take part in international cooperation, keep our market open, and work for mutual benefits with all countries. Thank you.
That's Chinese President Xi Jinping speaking at the digital economy event at the G20. Let's discuss this further with our studio guest, Professor Jiang Shixue from Shanghai University. Professor, Xi Jinping there spoke a little about his views on the digital economy and how that plays in the world economy today. What would you say are some of the highlights from that?
As you know that nowadays everybody enjoys good life from the so-called digitalization. Everybody relies on mobile phones and all kinds of things. So we need to create a good environment for this kind of digitalization. And also we need to push forward because there is no boundary for this kind of technological progress. And China and some other emerging economies are doing their good job pushing forward the technological progress. And in this regard, China and some other emerging economies should have the support from the developed countries. But however, as we have seen over the past several years, the U.S. is pushing forward its trade embargo against Huawei and many other Chinese economies, the so-called Chinese companies. So this is against the goodwill of the people in every corner of the world. Okay. Secondly, as President Xi Jinping said, we need to have a kind of clear set of rules for this for the future development of the digitalization. I think this is very important because without rules, well, you cannot push forward this kind of technological progress because this is a new area. And thirdly, Xi Jinping said that we need to respect the sovereign rights of every country to develop its digital economy.
And the conditions of
yes,
developing
and
countries.
the U.S. is a superpower in terms of science and technology. You should not dominate. You should not bully other weak economies in this kind of technological development. So I think these points are very important. Now, again, the key issue is whether or not the international community can act. Deeds are more important than words.
That's indeed. Thank you, Professor Jiang. Stay with us on The World Today. We'll be right back with more.
When world leaders speak, everybody listens. When world leaders listen, everybody benefits. Together we stand. Divided, we falter. The Group of 20 Summit in Osaka, Japan. Catch the highlights only on CGTN.